Well, hello, everyone. Let's talk today about the biotic interactions and coevolution in tropical rainforest. So, at first view of a tropical rainforest, what strikes you is, wow, it's a whole lot of green. And it's true. Most of the biomass, the biological mass of rainforest, is plant material, the ferns and mosses and epiphytes and trees. And in fact, it's kind of difficult to see any kind of animal life uh, because the amount of animal life is a very small percent of the biomass, 0.02% of the total biomass. But even though they're a small percent, animals play a very important role in tropical rainforest, in particular in their relationships with plants. And some animals can exert a positive influence on plants and helping them to pollinate and disperse their seeds. Because let's face it, plants can't move on their own. Some can exert a negative influence on plants, like herbivory. That is the consumption of a plant by an animal. And sometimes it's just not so clear whether it's positive or negative. There might be elements of both. Um, Animals play an important role in recycling the nutrients. And so by consuming material and getting it broken down and moving around, it moves it to other parts of the ecosystem, making nutrients available for other plants. And plants do have deterrents to try and not be consumed. And we'll get into that more in later chapters, but they can have physical and chemical defenses to prevent that. So let's talk about species interactions and the kinds of species interactions. And I'm going to use a shorthand to represent um, if the species benefits or not. And a plus means that a species benefits from an interaction with another species. The minus is that it doesn't benefit. In fact, it's harmed. And a zero would be neutral. There's no positive or negative effect to it. And so let's start here with mutualism. A mutualistic relationship is one in which two different species are interacting, and it's beneficial for both to have that interaction. And my example here is an orchid bee. And so the orchid bee is benefiting because it gets nectar, energy rich food from the orchid, and is attracted to that orchid. The orchid benefits because it is getting a pollination service. Plants can't move around, and so in order to have it efficiently fertilize another um, plant of the same species, we've got a specialized carrier of that pollen that will take the pollen from one flower to another flower. Next, let's consider commensalism. And in commensalism, one benefits and the other is unaffected. And my example for you for commensalism is the orpingula bird.
Orpendulas are social birds of the blackbird family. They live in colonies in large isolated trees and clearings, but near forests. Their nests are massive woven pouches that dangle from the branches. Handmade in Costa Rica.
So the orpingula bird is benefiting from this relationship because it has the nest. It has a place for it can raise its young that's out of harm's way. And the tree, however, is not benefited, but it's not harmed because these nests are dangling below the leaves, so it's not blocking the leaves getting sunlight. They're not very heavy, and so it just doesn't have a positive or negative effect. So that's our example of commensalism. Another example would be epiphytes growing in a tree. So, if one is benefiting and one is harmed, that would be considered parasitism or predation. So, what's shown here is a leaf miner, and this is an example of parasitism where we have a uh, an organism, an insect that has laid its young, and the young will develop and mine their way through and then eventually leave the leaf. And so, obviously, it is beneficial to the leaf miner to have a place to have its young safely protected and nourished, but it's of no benefit and actually is harmful to the leaf. Predation is also a plus minus, where the predator uh, is able to get benefit, but not the prey. An example might be of a seed predator, like a macaw eating seeds. And so the macaw has the benefit of getting the food, whereas the plant who produced the seed gets no benefit from its seeds being destroyed. And this one is not so common in nature, a minus minus, because there's no advantage to either species to have direct competition. It's head to head competition, where you got two species going for exactly the same resources. And in nature, that is not typically maintained uh, because it is harsh for both species that are doing the competing. I have here a light gap, and I imagine there might be plant species that are competing to take advantage of that light gap. So instead of competition, what evolution favors is what's called niche partitioning. And niche partitioning is when different species somehow subdivide the resources. And so they may be present on the same tree, for example, but not be using the exact same resources. Uh, like is shown here is the pygmy marmoset, which is feeding on sap from holes that it has ground into the bark, whereas the wood creeper, also feeding on the bark, is feeding on insects that it's taking from tree trunks. And so they could be in the same area, but they don't have exactly the same niche. They don't have the exact same resource. So they're not in direct competition. And these are both part of a bark foraging guild, uh, which allows me to bring up this term, ecological guild, a group of species, not necessarily related, that share a common resource spectrum. So this is from a naturalist notebook, and she's noting that this is a mixed flock that appeared mid-story along a stream. And so here we have a wide variety of birds traveling together using different resources. You can kind of tell from the various beaks that they have. Uh, and even though they are all traveling together from tree to tree, they're getting different resources from those trees than other birds, and so they're not in direct competition. And so that way they can kind of travel and work together. Resource partitioning, resource sharing. Take a look at this figure. It shows you a table of different species of African squirrels. Some are illustrated here, not all. And the African squirrels will vary in the habitat type, the vegetation height, the body size, and the food type, and their activity period. And so, as you can see, there is no two species that have exactly the same way of doing things. No two species have exactly the same niche. And so what that allows for is allows for the coexistence of different species together in one habitat, because they're avoiding that direct head-to-head competition. Instead, they're resource sharing resource partitioning um, the resources that are available. So, switching gears a little bit, now let's talk about the relationship that plants have with animals, in particular, the role that animals play in the dispersal of seeds. So, in order for a seed to be successful, it needs to be able to have sufficient light, and so it can germinate and grow into an adult. And the thing is that the seeds tend to fall most directly and abundantly by the adult because that's the source of the seeds makes sense. However, a seed in the shadow of its adult parent will not succeed because it's in the shadow. And so we call that the seed shadow effect. That is, there's the most seeds are most dense near their parent tree. And that's a problem because um, it's going to be shadowed by its parent. So the further the seed can get from the parent tree, actually, the better off, the more successful it's likely to be. And so evolution favors plants to have a way to get their seeds further away from the adult, namely fruit. So fruit contain the seeds, and fruit are enticing and nutritious, and they are attractive to animals, animal dispersers. Animals can move. And so the animal is attracted to the fruit, picks up the fruit, takes it some distance away from the parent, and then that is a possible way for the seed to be able to get away from and overcome that seed shadow effect. This is of particular importance in the dense interior rainforest because in the interior, the other mechanisms of dispersal, namely wind and water, don't have as big an effect. Because after all, you wouldn't have a lot of wind movement or movement of seeds by water within a dense forest. And so the seeds, the movement of seeds, the plants are dependent upon the frugivores. Frugivores is a fruit eating animal. And there's a mutualistic relationship between the animal and the plant that makes the fruits. So it could be that the seed gets ingested and then passes through the digestive tract and is exits out um, the back of the animal, so to speak, with a little bit of fertilizer to boot. Or it could be that the seed gets regurgitated, like we're seeing here with this quetzal, where it will cough up the seed of the avocado, much smaller than our avocados, cough up the seed of the avocado after it ingests the delicious fruity content. So there are advantages to being a frugivore, having a calorie-rich diet of non-toxic, typically delicious um, food materials that can be easily acquired. But there are also downsides of being a frugivore in that the fruit is typically lacking in protein, and so the animal has still a need for protein that's not being provided by the fruit. And fruit trees could be widely separated, and so the animal will have to uh, go from fruiting tree to fruiting tree, finding those fruiting trees. At a fruiting tree, you'll find a great variety of animal life attracted: birds, mammals like bats, monkeys, and agoutis, such as you see here, insects, and animals that eat insects, insectivores. This agouti is enjoying this palm fruit. Figs are a big attractor. When a fig tree goes into fruit, there can be thousands of figs attracting a wide variety of animals. And in fact, we have a whole video about this very topic. At fruit trees, one can find the droppers, those that drop the fruit down, the mashers that will mash up the fruit, dropping the seeds, the gulpers gulp the fruit down. The taste of the fruit is not as important because they're not tasting it, they're insensitive. There is a selective pressure towards producing small to medium fruit rather than large because small to medium fruit can be more easily carried away from the parent tree. Here we're seeing African hornbill and a tapir that are both seed dispersers. Now, these hyacinth macaws are seed predators. That is, they will uh, get at the seed and consume the seed. And so it's not being deposited, it's being consumed. Fish can be seed dispersers, interestingly enough, like the tambuki that are shown here. They are found in the Amazon flooded forest and play a big role in dispersing seeds. So, having fruit diet could influence the evolutionary pattern. For example, in these birds, the cock of the rocks, uh, being a frugivore may be tied to the need for these species to nest their young longer and to have elaborate mating behaviors. These are the males, these are the females, obviously brighter and gaudier. And it's believed that the energy that fruits provide may allow them to have this elaborate mating ritual that they have to posture one the males to get together to posture and show off how bright they are, how healthy they are. And the female's quite cryptic, uh, doesn't stand out at all. And so when the males get together to show off themselves, that's called a lek. These are the long-tailed manakins. So this is all on behalf of the rather dull looking female, and she will select the one that seems to be the most vigorous, the one with the brightest coloration, indicating good health, the one that's most fit, agile, indicating a lack of parasites and a strong immune system. And the females are the ones that are left with the chores of raising the young because they don't stand out so much, so they are with the young. And having a fruit based diet may attribute to the fact that they have a longer nesting time because it's not a balanced diet. Like I mentioned, it doesn't have protein, for instance, so it may take longer for the young to mature. Fruit trees have been used to reestablish forests, like you see in this reforestation project going on in West Kalimantan in Indonesia. By planting fruit trees and allowing them to grow, they can serve as a food magnet, and the fruit can be picked up, the seeds distributed, and that can facilitate the regrowth of forests. So let's talk now about coevolution. It's used to describe cases where different species affect each other's evolution reciprocally. One affects the other, and their fates, in fact, are entwined. So, pollination of flowers is a great example of coevolution because we'll find in the species we're seeing here, the bat and this white flowered plant, forms and behaviors evolve. that will enhance their mutualism, this plus plus relationship among them. The plant, the whiteness of the flower, easy to see at night for the bat. The muskiness attracts that bat, that smell. The shape of the flower, in this case, we're seeing a flat, brushy shape, making it easy for the bat to be able to come and brush up against. And having high protein in its nectar to nourish the bat. Um, the bats, well, they have large eyes to be able to find their flowers, strong vision, a well-developed sense of smell to be able to locate the flowers based on their smell, and a long tongue with which to reach the nectar in the flower. So these features in the bat or in the flower are to enhance this interaction, this important interaction, this service that the bat is doing for the flower. So we're seeing these features evolve because of the other species, and so that's coevolution. Another example would be the Victorian water lily. It has a scented flower as well. It's in this case, it's attracting its pollinator beetles. The flower itself maintains a warmer temperature, which is an attractor to the beetle. And the beetle, which wanders over, will get trapped into the flower overnight. And by the time it leaves in the morning, when the flower reopens to release the beetle, it's covered with pollen. Interestingly, after a flower is pollinated, it turns red and loses its scent and that extra heat, indicating that pollination is done, so not wasting any time on the beetle's behalf. So let's talk now about the leafcutter ants. And so they play a huge role in rainforests because they are able to harvest an enormous amount of leaf material, but they don't eat the leaves. What they do is they take the leaves and they use them to cultivate their fungal gardens. And so let's talk about the relationship not only among the ants and their fungus, but other players in this complicated coevolutionary system. And we'll find that there's both mutualistic, that is plus plus relationships going on, and also antagonistic, plus minus relationships going on. So let's start here with the ants. And the ants are taking the leaves to the garden and grooming their crops, taking care of their fungus by providing more material for the fungus to grow on. And the fungus here is the fungal cultivar, the specific fungus that was actually originally brought to the nest by the new queen. So that is definitely a positive relationship because the fungus gets a place to grow. The ants are able to eat the fungus because they cultivate it. There is another fungus that can be found within the nests of this ant, and this fungus consumes the cultivar, the cultivated fungus. So we now have a fungus that's parasitic to another fungus, and that would be antagonistic to the ants because this parasitic fungus is not a food source, and in fact, it is breaking down their food source. Well, the ants happen to carry a bacteria, actinomycetes, that lives on them in coevolution, but now between the bacteria and the ant. A positive relationship because the bacteria that is found on this ant produces a chemical that is harmful to the parasitic fungus. And so by carrying that bacteria, it reduces the problem that the ants have with the parasitic fungus. their problem because, again, the parasitic fungus is breaking down their food source. So the bacteria are mutualistic symbiosis with the ants. However, there is a yeast, and there's a yeast that is can be found in the ant gardens, a black yeast that feeds on the bacteria, the actinomycetes bacteria. And if the yeast is present, then the number of bacteria can be reduced because it is feeding on them. And so, if the ants are in the presence of this black yeast, then the bacteria numbers decrease. And so, the bacteria are not there to help keep the parasitic fungus in control. So, you can see why they call this a balancing act, because they're for the leafcutter ant nest to be successful, there has to be enough of the positive symbiotic relationships in order for the cultivar fungus to be successful and to feed the members of the leafcutter ant colony. So, one of the more complicated examples of coevolution among different species.